So welcome once again, and today delighted that our guest, our speaker for today is Melissa Jardine. So Melissa, welcome. This time you really are in the driving seat. And our perspective, our fourth perspective around this is the role of academia, and particularly in terms of academic research and studies. So before we actually sort of go in and ask some specific questions for Melissa, I'd just like to open up the floor to allow Melissa to share with us brief insight into your career, specific interests around this theme, and it'd be great if you can share anything that you're currently working on. So Melissa, welcome. Thank you once again, and over to you.
Thank you very much. It's an honour to be invited to be part of this series. So I'm going to talk through my career, and then that'll naturally lead into the academic part of things, because I'm very much practitioner, academic, or I sort of feel a bit strange being here as the academic speaker because I'm a bit of an accidental academic. And so I'll sort of talk through how that process and why that happened, why I ended up being an academic. So I was a police officer in Melbourne, Australia for 10 years, and I joined after having a Bachelor of International Relations, although in Victoria Police a degree isn't essential to join. It is in New South Wales, but not Victoria. And I think I was only one of 2 people in my squad of 28 who had been to university. And in the final month of my academy training, that was when the bombing of the Twin Towers happened on September 11, 2001. And I remember the screens were up all around the academy. Everywhere we went that day, everyone had the screens on, which usually, if you've been in a police academy, it's, you know, a bit more rigid than that. But everyone was in a bit of a state of shock, I think. And I remember seeing, you know, the attack happen over and over again on the screens, and thinking that the nature of police work that I thought that I was going to be coming into and joining was dramatically changed from that day. And so then as a constable, I studied a Master of Asian Studies part-time because I'd been studying to speak Vietnamese, and given Australia's proximity to Asia, I thought it might be useful knowledge later in my policing career. And so with that master's degree, I studied things like corruption, organised crime and counterterrorism in Asian contexts. Then a couple of years after finishing my master's degree, a colleague from Victoria Police forwarded me a form seeking expressions of interest to do a PhD on drug harm reduction programs in Southeast Asia on an Australian aid funded project. So this is about 2007 or 8. And so I was fortunate to get that PhD position, and with my supervisor at that time was Professor Nick Crofts, who I'm still working with today. So I'll speak more about that a bit later. But so Nick specifically wanted someone with a policing experience because the research was about understanding police culture in Southeast Asia and exploring why police acted in certain ways, which was sometimes inconsistent with legislation or previous practices. And so it was both a development project and a research exercise, which looked to use academic theories about police culture and discretion to advance a public health outcome that at the time was a strategic priority for Australia in preventing HIV in our region. So Nick was the one who saw the importance of having someone with practical police experience as the researcher to garner additional insights among the police being interviewed in Vietnam, as well as then using as an advocacy strategy the police culture and the bonds that police have across country borders. So I think police in this session, like Jane and Ali, would probably know that you can go to different countries and meet police, and you share a bond, an occupational bond, which sometimes, you know, may not happen with other institutional cultures. But that wasn't completely smooth sailing doing that PhD, because after a year and a half, I had to convert that PhD to a Master of Philosophy, because I was actually struggling quite a bit because I'd been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder from my police work. And even though I'd had the symptoms for a while, being undiagnosed, I didn't know what was wrong with me and why I was struggling so much. And so the police at that time also terminated my employment because of my PTSD, which I was pretty upset about, because I'd never considered a different career than being a police officer, and my studies on crime in Asia had all been gearing up for this sort of longer term career. But I was fortunate with Nick Crofts that he still wanted me to work when I could, or contribute voluntarily on some of the projects that he was working on. And, you know, he's been such an amazing mentor for me personally and professionally. But then after I finished that degree, I didn't want to be defeated, it seems, so I started another PhD. But this time I relocated to Sydney because I felt that still living in Melbourne, where there were so many triggers, was slowing my progress to get better. So, but the also benefit of that was that Professor Janet Chan was my supervisor in Sydney, and I'd come across her research doing my master's degree. And she used a theoretical framework from Pierre Bourdieu and about the logic of practice, and she applied it to policing. And when I saw this, it's, you know, to me, it's quite a complex theoretical framework, but I still felt that it really explained how I then could understand my own behaviours when I was a police officer. And so this really resonated with me about how academic research can be used to understand police, because this so accurately seemed to reflect my own personal experience. So then I wanted to find out how I could use this in the context of Vietnamese policing. So my PhD in Vietnam focused on police recruitment and training, police community relations, as well as women police. And so in Vietnam, they have a 10 to 15%, depending on the role, maximum quota for women in the police force. And, you know, I just found this quite unfair, so I really wanted to explore it. And I'd been told by male police there that there was so many more women who wanted to become police officers in Vietnam than this maximum quota could account for. And because that quota also meant that women on average had to get a higher pass mark to be accepted into the academy because of the small positions available. So this was one aspect of my research, and it was also where I really learnt about the importance of reflexivity and positionality in research, and really looking at who I am as a researcher when I'm studying other cultures, and then what I might, what insights I might have or can understand from my own position. Because when in the interviews with some of the women, when I asked how they felt about the quota, they said that they thought it was appropriate, and that, you know, women were only suited to certain types of police roles. And so I found this quite confronting because I guess as a feminist and an advocate, I was wanting to use academic research and evidence to support an advocacy position that I held. And that I wanted to use this research to, you know, advance a position outside of academia. But it wasn't, even though the majority of women said that, there were other women who really strongly opposed it, and there were others who were, you know, not quite as strongly opposing, but not everyone agreed, but it was a majority that said that. But in saying that, there's also limitations about being a foreign researcher in a one-party state, perhaps what women might say to a researcher, especially when the government may not appreciate dissenting views to official policies. But I guess that the role of academia in advancing gender equality is looking at different ways of looking at a problem. And so using the doing and undoing gender framework, which explain the social incentives for men and women to act in certain ways, helped me explain some of the findings in Vietnam, especially since one policewoman said that if she wanted to work more in policing and more operational experience and have wider experience, it might be seen by her wider family that she was putting her career before family, and that would mean she could be excluded from the family because her primary role is to be as a wife and a mother. And so there are these, even though she had insight into these pressures, it was the expectation that she would perform this gender role, even though she was working full-time as a police officer. She had to work in an administrative role so she could manage the expectations that were outside of work. And so those, you know, academic frameworks helped me understand, you know, more about why women and men perform gender in certain ways, as well as the cultural context that shape the nature of the incentives to perform in ways or to avoid backlash by acting in contravention to a gender norm. And I know Jane's very familiar with the feminist institutional approach, which further elucidates gender structures in terms of what shapes gender norms and expectations of women, the formal and informal influences. And Eleanor, I think, is on this too. I have your paper right here. It's a very good paper. And what I found really interesting in that, in terms of the gendered power relations, is what's perceived as normal gender structures. And in the paper, you do talk about it in post-conflict context, and post-conflict, returning to normal may not actually be in the best interest of women. But then, for example, when I think about what is normal in Vietnam for women wanting to join the police, or may be quite different to Australia, where the structures of and incentives for operational policing can be a bit different. But one of the limitations of academic research is that we need more research about different contexts and from the context and people who are being affected by what is being studied. So I'm very interested in Raewyn Connell's Southern Theory, which looks at how there's an asymmetry of knowledge, and knowledge production, which is focused on the global north. And so because of the developed nature of our country's generally high education standards, university institutions that can produce research that is accepted into the international standard, that it's in English, all of these things mean that there is a tendency for research from the developed Western metropoles about what we know about the world. Whereas if we think about different contexts, rural contexts, places in the global south, even though I'm in the global south technically in Australia, it's sort of also a metaphor about power dynamics. So Australia is sometimes considered global north because of the majority of development, but the lifestyle and living standards of some of our Indigenous populations is considered global south. And so even though there might be research being published by people in the contexts that they're being, but in the context where they're occurring, they might not actually get published in international journals because maybe, yeah, they might not be in English, or they their institutional and academic traditions may be different to what is accepted into the international standard, as well as sometimes there's limitations on people having access to education, tertiary or otherwise, which people like me, I guess, take for granted. But there are efforts to make sure that this asymmetry doesn't continue, as well as some of the feminist methodologies that are being used, such as training women in the country of focus to be a researcher, to research the women in their communities. Like I think that's happening at Monash. So there are limitations to academic research, and because we don't actually have a full picture of the problems that we're trying to solve, because there's such an asymmetry of knowledge there. And so in terms of the rural aspect, we heard Mary in session 1 talking about the challenges for rural women in South Africa. And with respect to the role of academic research here, you know, what ideally would happen is that there would be more investment in making sure that the rural women that are there can undertake their own research to help investing in them to solve their own problems, but not just problems, but also to make sure that the lessons that they've learned can be disseminated to the global north. There's things that they are, I'm sure, doing that we could really learn from and benefit from. Yet, because of this asymmetry in what we have available as evidence, the problem there is to the dissemination and access to those lessons. And it's so good to have forums like this where we can hear it, but we really need to amplify those things. And so academia really needs to invest in those, or other institutions. Again, when Vio spoke in session 2, I was so impressed with the way that the youth organised as peace builders, and it reminded me about the importance of a community of practice. And so academics don't produce research on their own. And it takes experienced experts like youth to define what is important for them, what are their insights and lived experiences of it, and how they define the problems and solutions. And so a community of practice involves, you know, academics, people affected, policymakers, other practitioners, stakeholders who all have input into a problem. And I think that that is the way that we can advance from research into policy and practice, is to make sure that there's more diversity around who's contributing to those discussions.
Melissa, if I can just come in, thank you for that very, very informative insight. I mean, that's it's really good to hear your own journey, but also to really put you know, these issues into the current context. And actually, for me, as I was listening, it really resonates for me a current challenge, and that is about working in Somalia, how to encourage Somali people to accept international research, even to the extent of data which is being perceived as being developed and driven by the international. So even though huge sums invested in World Health, UNICEF, Save the Children, all of these very, very credible organisations who have invested considerable sums of money in research and data gathering, But actually what I found is that the greatest challenge is actually getting that accepted. So really interesting hearing that from you. So I guess one question is, we recognise that it's an issue. What do we do about it? And then the second thing is that where I have seen lots of research done, it's almost for me, okay, so what are we going to do with it? You know, students have invested considerable years of their lives, gone through many challenges to actually produce you know, a really informative, a really relevant piece of work. But how do we then translate that into action? So I welcome your thoughts on that.
Well, I guess maybe I have a perspective just from my experience, but you know, I with some of the drug policy projects that I work on, there's a research paper that says that interviewed policymakers about how they found out about you know, latest drug policies or trends, and you know, irrespective of there was an infinite amount of research papers. The most common place that they got their information was from Google. So that sort of presents the challenge, but what it says is that it needs to be digestible. So even though people spend a lot of time producing research, it needs to be presented to people of influence in a way that they can digest. But also we need to recognise that even though we may talk about evidence-based policy, that often the result is evidence-informed policy because of the political palatability of what may be being proposed. So that's, you know, one challenge is about how it's presented. But the other thing is that, and I think Jane's actually a good example of this, in that I think there also needs to be people who have been socialised into, in this narrow case, I'm talking into policing, or into the maybe the people who have experience in who you're studying, so I'm talking about policing, but also who have been socialised into academia. So academia, you know, when I joined the police, I had, you know, different sort of norms, ways of speaking and communicating, and then being socialised into academia. You know, there's different ways of thinking, the way of speaking. And so I think that, you know, we don't just need language translators, we need cultural translators, including occupational cultural translators. And so, you know, with different types of intersectionalities, you know, people talk about code switching, you know, but I think code switching, you know, I would do sometimes between talking to police and talking to academia about the same thing. So the way you might get a message across might be just framed differently, or in different words, or you know, understanding the police culture. I would be thinking about which aspects of the evidence are going to resonate with them. So in terms of, you know, broadening that, I think that in a sense we don't want to lose expertise, but there's also a bit of, you know, multi-skilling, and so, you know, I think that for me, I feel like I'm sort of an academic, sort of, well, a police officer. Actually, I realised recently that I've now been sort of in academia longer than I was a police officer. So I sort of figured, do I actually have to let go of my identity as a former police officer, because I'm now in a stage where I've had much longer in a different type of environment, although I still obviously work with police a lot. But I think, yeah, so so then in different contexts, you know, of course, it's not just the police officer, it's the youth, like VIO. And, you know, with Yuli, you know, peacekeeping, of course, you can have academics do the research, but you need the practitioners to really be giving the insights. So it's, again, about that community of practice that I think having people who are from the different fields need to be in conversation.
Melissa, thank you. And I sort of noticed that there were a number of heads were nodding as you certainly made some of those comments there. Just to reassure you that if you've been a police officer for 10 years, then I think we would all agree that you can carry that badge for many more years to come. Just one more question from me before I want to open it up to the floor. What would you, if somebody came to you today and said that they were really interested in doing almost sort of a groundbreaking, a really significant piece of research around women in peacekeeping, what would that piece be, and has it already been done?
I'm not sure I can speak as much to peacekeepers as I can to national police forces.
Well, that's it. We'll come back to that one, but that we can adapt to the question then. So it's about women in policing. I'll allow you that that adaptation, but I'll make sure that we come back to that before we finish. But let's open it up, because you know, we've got a good sort of good number of people participating today. Lots of very varied experience. So so let's open up the floor to questions for Melissa.
Just on the point, actually, that Melissa made at the end there, certainly when I did my research, I mean, I'm not in dizzy heights of a PhD, but in masters, that, you know, we that have been on the ground and in policing, wherever that is, we know how suspicious the police are of outsiders who don't have that police credibility telling them this is how things could be done. And I think it is an important part of, you know, certain research. And like you said, in Somalia, it's that credibility piece of where the research has come from. So, and I did notice a difference, certainly with my research in Albania and Kosovo, and with the police systems there, that it allowed me to have, certainly in Albania, have access probably that I may not have had I not been a police officer. And it sort of followed me in my new consultancy role, that when you're delivering, certainly as a international from the global north, which the UK is definitely in there, going to countries, and I've noticed that Amina Begum is now on from Bangladesh, but I've been working with Bangladesh police, men and women, on gender-based violence. And being when they realise that you have lived through it and that you are an ex-police officer yourself, you know, it's so much easier to deliver. So to me, research almost follows that same pattern, that if you really want to make inroads, I'm not saying that only ex-police or ex-security services people who do research are credible, but I think researchers need to be looking for those people to support the research, perhaps, you know, work on a team of research. So yeah, that was something that I've certainly experienced.
My name is Larina Bright, and I'm the Executive Director of Mission 89, which is a research, education, and advocacy organization that is tackling child trafficking in sport. Obviously, research is very important to us, and just because the issue of football trafficking or trafficking is still not, there isn't much data around it, because like many other forms of human trafficking, it is, you know, we're still dealing with hidden populations. And also, you know, we have the data that does exist is, you know, a figure of about 15,000, or is it 30,000 rather, sorry, that is being quoted, by an organization that carried out this research, but then the methodology was called into question because the organization itself was somewhat discredited for other reasons. But I think as far as the credibility of research, it does depend on, one, the methodology, and the methodology would also include as well the participant samples as well. So how diverse, as you mentioned at some point, Melanie, is the research, you know, and those that are involved in it. So I think if even if it's considered international research, if the people that are receiving this research don't believe it to reflect their reality, then maybe you know, maybe the credibility is questioned. But also, as also was mentioned before, I think the contextualization is very important, because it can be conceived for academics, as most research tends to be conceived for. But then if it's intended for a particular, you know, stakeholder group, then the language, the terminology definitely needs to reflect this. But by and large, I think, you know, something that's often missing with grand research and great data and all that is almost a communication strategy, or rather dissemination strategy. You know, so there's a lot of good research, but there needs to be almost an intentional or a plan of how to get this research to the intended beneficiaries. And that would include, you know, translations, obviously, but contextualization, you know, the platforms that they're on, you know, for instance, how do these stakeholder groups, or the beneficiaries, how do they best receive, you know, the information that is being presented to them? You know, if it's in a village or if it's a camp, for instance, you know, perhaps the camp leaders are the ones that need to receive this data and be convinced of it, and then they in turn, you know, will work with the researchers to disseminate it. So that's just some long-winded, but just some thoughts on what you were saying. Thank you.
Oh,
that's great.
That's
Thanks,
fantastic. And I just wanted to talk about, I'm glad that you mentioned communications, because it's not just the dissemination of the academic part, it's that translational and the communications to all the stakeholders. But like, you know, sometimes with a budget to do a project, even if it is an international development type one, you know, the budgets don't always include enough money to cover communications. And so you might do great work, but unless you can leverage it by having a, you know, a communication strategy that is implemented well, you don't, you know, maximize the impact. And I think that, yeah, it's really underestimated in how much time communications takes, and the skills required in that translation from the research to different audiences, and the different formats and platforms. So yeah, I think that is something that, if, you know, in my cases, you know, like, we might have academics working on a project, and then you've got academics trying to disseminate it, and, you know, it's a different skill.
It's a different skill, yeah.
Yeah, you know, but maybe one sort of good news, I think, is that I've got a new project just about to start, which is to look at you know, innovative sort of it's conflict resolution and public health and law enforcement programs globally. And in that budget, we have put in a significant amount for communications, which you know, I think is unusual. We're hoping that it's all fine and it's passed. But and I think the donor is really supportive of that and really wants to maximise that. But in my experience, my limited experience, that's not always the case. And the communication aspect is a really underfunded aspect. So I'm really glad that you raised that. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lorena. Thanks, Melissa. Okay, let's go to Alice and then we'll go to
just
Ellie.
Say thank you, Melissa, really interesting, and also Lorena as well, because my feeling was it's so fascinating, this discussion. I think it could go quite a long way, because I think you flagged up a really key sort of part that hasn't been talked about enough or discussed enough. And one of the things I thought was the credibility is also helped if there are partners, if research just doesn't come in isolation, that it's part of a program, that it's seen as part of a wider thing. And I think also would be those interested, like policing, who are perhaps unwilling to take on new research from outside, to see it, use the word pilot, that it's got a beginning, a middle and an end, and there's time for reflection. I think what people are worried about very often is having things imposed on them and they can't get out of it. And so that was one thing I was going to add. And the other thing was that Lorena, your idea of the comms strategy, I think is utterly crucial. And Melissa's sort of flagged it up and has even got a good example. But I think they ought to be part of any partnership as a sort of given, really. And I think that if you've got strong partners, you're more likely to gain more funding and more proactive donors as well. So I was, and also the platforms. Lorena, you mentioned what platforms are you using? Who you need? It's the strategy that needs to be worked out alongside the research. So Melissa, Lorena, thank you so much. Lots to think about. Jane, I don't know, because you've had experience with UN Women, working with UN Women. Have you had any experience of this from the UN Women side of things? Because I represent UN Women UK just as a member here in London, but always interested to know what UN Women is actually doing on the ground. Thanks.
Sorry, can I just respond to that, please, Ellie? And then I know Ellie from Lebanon is waiting. Just very quickly, and I think it does fit with this communication piece. The work I'm been doing with UN Women on this global handbook, and Jerry Campbell is also on the call, who assisted me very greatly in a lot of the content. That was a global handbook to improve the response of police officers to gender-based violence. But when it all started, the language it was very, almost academic, but very UN type language. And the UN language is very academic. So, and I, Jerry, and the other colleague, Graham Golden was another, we realised that you've got to speak the language of the people that you're targeting, your target audience. Because if you don't, they will just not entertain it. So we actually, initially I had a little bit of a battle, but we had to go through things and we changed wording, and it does make a big difference. You've got to, it's the old, basic communication. Who is your target audience, and speak to them. But I don't want to take up too much time because I know there's a queue now of questions. So back to you, Ellie.
Thank you very much. And Ellie, please ask your question.
Okay, thank you so much. First, thank you, Jane, for inviting me. This is my first time with you. I'm so happy and I'm so honored. Melissa, I would like to thank you for your intervention. I would like to highlight on, first of all, I'm Eli Al-Asmar. I'm from Lebanon, the head of the Research and Studies Division at the Internal Security Forces of Lebanon. I'm a university professor and ran for 6 years the Department to Combat Human Trafficking. So I worked very closely with the victims, with survivors of human trafficking, with sexual exploitation. And at the same time, I'm a representative of my headquarters to all the national committees related to GBV and SGBV. Regarding your intervention, Melissa, I think that research is very important. Okay, so it is. I think it's the cornerstone for all policies and for all procedures. The problem for us resides in the feasibility and in the application of these research. So it's very easy to analyze, to research, to recommend, but the problem and the core of the problem is in the applicability of these recommendations and of these policies, and how to develop policies and the procedures or internal regulations. Okay, this is first. You talked about the difficulty and the resistance when you talked about how people, how they accept to introduce international standards in their internal context. Okay, I think that the best practice for this is to engage heroes from the institution, from the police, to engage decision makers, and in this way we can have some influence, and we can lead by example. Okay, that is from my own experience, that is the only way to translate theories, research, recommendations, opinions into policies and into SOPs. And we had in Lebanon an achievement, a big success, when we conducted research with famous university like Lebanese American University, like University of St. Joseph. So we conducted researches, and at the end of these researches, we put some recommendations. According to these recommendations, we developed in the internal security forces some regulation and some internal memos in order to enforce the ideas came out from these researchers. So I wanted to share my experience, and I wanted to emphasize on the topics that you raised. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I mean, I think that's another example of the importance of not only doing the research, but it's the communication strategy and having those translational pieces into the internal regulations, the memos that you say. And as Jane said, it's also changing the language from the research and to the language of the audience, which, you know, it can be tricky and it can take time and I've only, you know, done a little bit of it, but it's hard to sometimes really think about how you're translating the message into the language of someone else. So yeah, that's fantastic to hear. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ellie. Thanks, Melissa. Jerry, can I come to you for your question?
If I may, I'd just like to make some comments before I leave the session. So I've got to chair a statutory domestic homicide review, a homicide of a woman. Just a couple of points, just briefly. So Jerry Campbell from London. I was in policing for 30 years. Before then moving on to my next career. Melissa, can I just say that thank you for your presentation, and I left policing 4 years ago after, say, 30 years, but what I can say is that once you are a former officer, then you're still part of the club, so you'll always be a former police officer, and you'll always be recognised for that within the wider policing family, if I can say that. And so, having been involved with you know, policing at different levels throughout 30 years, and have had the pleasure of working in many international jurisdictions, I think academia coming together to inform operational policing, you know, where both come together and work seamlessly together, I think is so vitally important. And you know, one of my, I think, biggest regrets in some of the work that I have done throughout the years was not working with academics much sooner in my policing career. And as I said, I worked at many different levels, including up to the rank of Detective Chief Superintendent. One of few people in London that were told that rank. But the point in saying that is I feel that I should have worked a lot more with academia throughout and at different stages and in different ways throughout my career. So I think it's really, really important to do that. The other point around was, and some of the last speakers, including Jane, have mentioned this, is the use of language. The use of academic language can, I think, be a turn-off for operational frontline cops in terms of their decision-making, how they interpret the language, and then how they then not only interpret the language, but using the learning from the academic research to inform their practice on the front line. So we've got to think differently about how that message is communicated and transmitted, and therefore interpreted, and more to the point, understood by people providing the services. I think is absolutely critical. But I am a massive fan of academia coming together with law enforcement and other agencies to inform practice on the front line. Ultimately, it's about how we improve the quality, the effectiveness, the efficiency of the services that we deliver to victims and to victim survivors and their children is absolutely fundamental. So I think we are perhaps approaching it, trying to achieve the same outcome, the same objectives, and maybe taking a couple of different journeys to get to that same point. But academia with law enforcement is absolutely vital. So thanks for what you do. Jen and Ellie, massive thank you for your leadership in this series, short series as well. Thank you.
And Jerry, before you go, I just thought I'd plug, I'm not sure if you've heard of the Law Enforcement and Public Health Conference series. It's a conference that we bring together academics, practitioners, people with lived experience, police, and last year in Edinburgh, Jane was one of our plenary speakers, and also Jane and Ellie co-facilitated a specific gender consultation where we brought people together, a smaller group together for a few days. But that is one of the activities that we are doing to try and bring all of those stakeholders together. And I know you have to go, but another thing is we also, another thing about the differences in what we know and the knowledge that's available is that there's some countries where the police need to do a research degree or research as part of their degree before they're police officers. So in Vietnam, the police are the only ones that are allowed to study police. So, well, you know, mostly. But yeah, so there are different models, and I know the UK and I think Australia, to an extent the US, don't necessarily value or haven't valued academic knowledge as for practitioners, and I know the troubles that have been going on in the UK with that. But yeah, I just thought I'd mention that there's different relationships between police and academia around the world.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. That's great.
No, thank you.
Okay, bye.
Thanks, Jerry. Thanks, Melissa. And Jerry, I think also that that all of us have got an opportunity, hopefully now, to really facilitate and try and sort of encourage sort of colleagues in senior policing positions to really recognise and respect the role that that academic research can take.
Yeah,
can be used to inform.
100%.
I think that's great. Okay, we've been strict on time so far. We've got a couple of minutes to go, so I'm going to go back to Melissa.
Sorry,
I'm going to.
Ellie, I'm just wondering if Barbara has a quick comment. I know she's been patiently waiting.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see. Barbara, please.
Very quick. I'll echo what Jerry and the others have said, how in terms of language and how it's important to present things in a language that communicates with people on the ground. that are actually delivering the services and so on, that is digestible and understandable. But my other question was, and thank you, Melissa, for sharing your story. My other question was that in terms of looking at Vietnam, and it's obviously a very, very different culture, and you talked about the women who were quite accepting of there being a quota, quite accepting of that they would only undertake certain roles, and there were consequences if they didn't follow that. But at the same time, we recognise that there's a need to get more women into police so that the policing service reflects the local needs of women in terms of their security and protection and so on. Was that an issue in terms of the research? And how do we overcome that obstacle to get more women to talk about that and to talk about the change they'd like to see if they want to see that change? And it's not saying that we've always got it right, because maybe they've got it right. How do we overcome that obstacle to make sure that our research is credible and that we're reflecting the voices of those people? Thank you.
Well, there's some research by Professor Mangai Natarajan, who studied in India and talked about the perhaps different pathways for pathways to gender equality in traditional societies. So she talks about how even though women may enter police force, even though women may start in sex segregated positions, it may be the only way that women can enter those positions in that culture, but it may be a pathway into the organisation. But that's a very different thing to Australia. We are deployed in the same way, and I don't really think that it would be acceptable to do that to segregate it in our culture. But the Professor Natarajan says that that's appropriate for some cultures, and even though it's a pathway to equality, it might just be a longer pathway. It's still on the way, but I also do take there's different complications around the Vietnam story. That's just a stark example, but there are definitely women who want more experience. And another example of that is that when people get accepted into the academy, they can nominate 3 preferences for where they get deployed. And one woman that I interviewed said that she wanted to be a criminal investigator, and that was her top choice, but she wasn't allowed to do that because she was a woman. She was sent to administration, and because they specialise in their training for 4 years, if you study administration policing for 4 years, that pretty much narrows your career path. But what she did was, after 1 year of studying administration, she negotiated a swap with a male student in the criminal investigations course, and then he went and did administration, and the senior managers approved that. So there are things that women will do to get to where they want, and I think that there will be a trend towards more of that. I think that there's also, and it's really interesting, and one thing that I found quite interesting in the research that I just did with UN Women, UNODC and Interpol on women police in ASEAN, is that it was just not a deep exploration, but we looked at the women's unions or associations in each country, and there wasn't necessarily a relationship between a strong police union or a dominant or a pervasive police women's association and the number or diversity of the number of women and the diversity of roles that they were undertaking. So in Vietnam, for example, they have a very strong women's union, but the women's union doesn't really see its role as advocating for changing that quota, even though there are women who want it changed. and part of that is because of the political situation. So it's a one-party state, the Communist Party. The Women's Union sits subordinate to the Communist Party, so they also have to do, you know, they're not quite independent. But as well, there is, you know, a certain amount of status that they associate with femininity and the role of the mother in their culture. So there's critique of the Women's Union in Vietnam that it actually entrenches gender roles as opposed to providing, you know, more opportunities. But so with that woman I used as the example who tried to transfer to the operational specialisation, you know, I think that will become more common. I think in general there are societal level changes in gender norms. And so then once that starts happening a bit more, you know, the exception hopefully might become the norm, and it becomes you know, less exceptional for those women. There was another thing. Oh, yeah, and so then with respect to women's associations, actually one study that I think could be quite good, I haven't seen any, but Jane might be able to, and Ellie might know more about. There's lots of research about the importance of women's networks in business and other organisations, but not necessarily in policing. And I think it would be interesting because in Singapore, they only just established it's a women's committee, which has some high-ranking police women that are focal points, and then there's departmental focal points who act as liaisons for women who want advice. But that's only been the last 4 years set up, I think. So, yeah, Singapore is probably one of the most diverse police forces with women doing a lot more wider operational roles and holding much higher, many more women in higher ranks and operational ranks. So they've actually invested a lot in communications and promoting the diversity of roles for women. So they have, you know, portraits of women in riot gear and in different types of policing roles that they promote to try and break down those perceived gender barriers of what women police should do and what men should do. So even though that's sort of, we also asked them about what diversity policies or anything that they have, and Singapore has a lot of racial diversity and sometimes tension, I guess, but it seems that there is a level of success that they've achieved in making that diversity work without formalising it. So there's not a lot of policies. They said they don't discuss diversity, you know, in those terms, yet they're really quite successful in making, in promoting women. Whereas other countries that have really strong, you know, structured all throughout society, women's associations and in the police force, they are, you know, not as effective or not having an impact. So women's associations can, and from the research with business, sometimes they can be ineffective and sometimes create tension in the workplace. So it's not necessarily, I think maybe it's what the association or network does that's important, not necessarily the shape of it.
Thank you, Melissa. Yeah, some really, really interesting sort of thoughts and perspectives there. And I just dropped a note in the chat to say that certainly from my own experience at the moment, I'm really keen to understand how, you know, significant organisations like the London School of Economics, who are being funded actually by the UK government to do some research in Somalia, is to really understand how they're going to operationalise it, and, you know, are there opportunities maybe to mentor sort of young Somali women as well as part of this whole transition. Because for me, you know, not only is it about, you know, reassuring around the credibility of the actual work itself, but then for me, it's actually about the operationalizing it as well. So given the time, I'm going to let you off that question just this once. But yeah, just to say, fantastic discussion, and yeah, I really think that there's opportunity here for lots of continued thought and dialogue, and hopefully sort of sharing experiences. One thing that I've really taken away is the code switching. That's going to be my phrase for the day, and really thinking about how do we switch that language and switch that code between the different audiences. So so real sort of takeaway for me. So these 4 particular sessions.
I just said while code switch. I was just saying
we're looking forward to it. Good.
While being authentic, code switching and being authentic at the same time in both codes.
Right. Okay. Okay, that's great. Thank you. So yeah, so this concludes the 4 sessions. Sincere thanks to everybody again, and a special thanks from me to Jane and Leah as well. This has been an exciting journey for us, and some really fascinating insights. We've met some amazing individuals as well, and I know that Jerry's gone, but I really do hope that that all of us can use our leadership and influential positions to really use all of this and make some difference. So this is about peace, and yeah, we wish everybody a really peaceful day, and hope that all of us can continue to make that difference. So I know that Jane will be doing her editing, and should be posting very soon. Please feel free to share with others and encourage others to join us, hopefully in the not too distant future. So sincere thanks, and goodbye to everybody.